Here we are, Real Dirt with Chip Baker. On today's Dirt, I have Andrew Livingston. Say hello, Andrew.
Thanks for having me, Chip.
It's a pleasure having you. Andrew, we always have such great conversations.
It's natural. Hopefully this one will be as well.
Yeah, and when I thought about doing a podcast, you were one of the first people to come up.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
You always incite thought and create argument or a different way of looking at the program. It's always number-oriented, backed up with facts and statistics, and you look at it a little differently. You seem to have like this sweet devil's advocate type of style.
Yeah, it's probably comes from some of my like contrarian, slight libertarian roots. I've always had issues with authority. So hopefully that's just not physical authority, but it's also authority of argument, right? When someone thinks they know something and they're so confident that it's one way, it's always nice to spin rhetorical circles and find ways to convince them that maybe they should look at this from a different angle.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's how we keep learning.
Yeah.
Right. And I've learned tons from talking to you and Jordan after work, so to speak. Just examining the situation and pondering and thinking about what's going on.
Yeah, no, it's always nice to be able to riff with some people who really know what they're talking about in this industry, and that's why being at Vicente Sederberg, the place I'm at, it's so enlightening and enjoyable because there's so many people that can talk about this issue. It's a very complex issue in some really fascinating and interesting ways, and can talk about it in depth from knowledge. And there's enough different viewpoints that it kind of triangulates in a way that you can look at an issue holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are here in our Denver studios today, and Andrew works for Vicente Sederberg as an analysis.
Yeah, so right now I'm the director of economics and research, but that's mainly because I can make my own title. And I ran out of business cards, which meant that I was going to get a title change.
Right.
So my background is in economics and regulatory studies and really policy analysis. I actually worked for Vicente Sederberg during the Amendment 64 campaign.
This is 2012.
Yeah, so I moved into Denver in August of 2012. Came out here to really do as much as I can to promote marijuana legalization that was on the ballot. And so I got a job with an organization known as COPIRG, or the Colorado Public Interest Research Group. It's part of a national organization that's really kind of, it's a left-leaning advocacy group. And I was doing voter registration coordination on the campuses of DU, of University of Denver. I mean, voter registration is what it is. The organization I didn't really enjoy working with. So in about September or so, I left COPIRG, just quit, and worked on the campaign. I knew some people that were working on the campaign. I knew Brian. I knew of Brian, really. That's probably the best thing to say. And then I knew a woman, Shalene Title, who's pretty awesome. She works up in Boston currently doing THC staffing, which connects jobs to employees and employers in the marijuana industry. And she was working on the campaign.
Who is this?
Shalene Title.
Yeah, just contracted them to help find me some employees, as a matter of fact.
Oh, yeah. So THC is great. So
I'll drop your name tomorrow. My conversation with her. Right.
So
I'm not even in the cannabis industry, so to speak. We don't touch the plant, but I want someone who's familiar with the parts and pieces so they work in my organization well, and that's why I went to them.
Yeah, no. So I knew Shalene from Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which I can get into, and that's a student organization on campuses around the country to really end the drug war, not only marijuana legalization, but educate students about all sorts of different drugs, how to interact with them well, harm reduction, negative policy on students, and things like that. So I knew her from my student activism and just jumped into the campaign and decided I'm going to volunteer full-time until this wins. And so that was probably about September to November. It was a wild and fun ride. It was one of the first campaigns that I've ever worked on. And I think it was probably better than most campaigns for a number of reasons. One, it was well
about weed.
Well, yeah, of course it was about weed, which was great. And there's just a lot of fun times with people working on the issue. I cared about it passionately. It was well enough funded, and there was enough interest, and it always felt like it had a good chance of passing. It never felt like it was going to for sure pass, but it's a good enough chance of passing. And so I worked on that campaign. It was awesome. And that's how I got to know Josh and Mason and Brian Vicente and Christian as well, who was keeping the law firm afloat at that time. After the campaign won in November, I had some ideas, some business ideas I was trying to work on with some friends, but the reality was I was at that time only 22, and all my friends were also 22, and it was just a little bit too early to start a business on an entrepreneurial level.
You need a little life experience.
Yeah, though the business idea is still really good, so it's in my back pocket for when I need to whip it.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. And so I worked on the campaign. One of the first job I ever did for Vicente Sederberg was actually looking at all the voter data on a precinct level from Amendment 64 to try to figure out how did one city vote versus another, because all of the information is provided at the county level for voter data, but cities in Colorado straddle counties very frequently. And so if you wanted to lobby, let's say, the city of Lafayette or Aurora.
Aurora's a great example.
You need to know exactly how many people voted. So I crunched all of that data and I was like, hey, will you pay me like $250 if I do all this work? Josh was like, yes, of course. And I was like, it's only going to take me a small amount of time. It took me a huge amount of time, but it was enjoyable. It was my first marijuana business check. And then I just kind of kept doing work for Vicente Sederberg. They knew me, they trusted me, and they knew that I had some analysis and knowledge chops. So I kept doing a little bit of work for them. And during the Amendment 64 task force and the implementation, just went to every single meeting and kept kind of work on that. And so that's how I found my way into the job. I kind of built out a policy analysis, and then Jordan Wellington, and he and I built our compliance department together. But my background's in economics, and so that whole time I was doing market modeling, projections, and so I've really developed just into economic research and analysis for the cannabis industry, nationally and a little bit internationally.
Right. So basically, you're a numbers nerd.
Yes, that's actually my favorite. You probably heard me say that before. Right. That's my favorite way to call myself. I'm a big fan of alliterations.
Right.
And so numbers nerd flows.
Right. Yeah, we're probably we're similar in many ways because numbers prove all, math proves all. I, however, don't believe I ever passed a math class legitimately.
I did okay.
Yeah. I was too busy trying to get life experience instead of going to statistics class.
Well, I had a chemistry teacher in high school. Great woman. She always said she knew which kids were good at math but not good at school by how well they can convert ounces to grams. And there were certain kids in class who never did great on tests but knew exactly how many grams were in an ounce and could do the math on pounds to grams faster than anyone else. And maybe that came from some background experience.
That's funny. Math never made sense to me until it was money. Literally. Literally. That's what it took. And as soon as it became commerce, money, then I started to understand it. But it took till I was out of college before that happened. Right. And now math's a daily part of my life every single day. And that's what you do. You gather these awesome data and statistics from all types of resources all over the city, the state, the country, the world even, to understand what's going on with the cannabis market.
Yeah, so the cannabis market is, at this point, some of it's numbers, but most of it is actually words. And the reason I say that is because impacts the cannabis market, depending on which state you're in, is first and foremost what the regulations say.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Every state's different. Every town's different.
So you
can't just grow a plant and sell some weed and make money for it. Make money.
Way harder than that. And, although half the country has a medical marijuana law, we just, passed we've got 25 states now, including Ohio. Those medical marijuana laws are all very different.
Absolutely.
And medical marijuana in and of itself is different than a normal consumer market for any other product. Because what you have to look at first and foremost is what is your consumer size and what are your qualifying conditions? And the qualifying conditions in a state like California, where you can literally walk up to a place on the street, not even being a resident of California, and get a medical marijuana card in less than an hour. It's just going to be very, very different than the requirements and the market size in a state like New York, where chronic pain isn't a qualifying condition and you can really just get it for cancer and HIV AIDS and, a handful of other issues, ALS and Parkinson's. And, so you have to look really at what the words say, the words that are in the law, that are in the initiative, that are in the regulations.
Absolutely. And, to speak of California, it was one of the first states to really have a legitimate functioning economy in medical cannabis.
Yeah.
But it was always, and still remains, this gray market economy.
Yeah.
Because it's not like Colorado or Oregon or Washington currently, where the commerce is monitored.
Yeah.
Right.
From a state level.
From a state level, the cannabis is monitored. Here in Colorado, we have seed to sale tracking.
Yeah. So,
right?
so
and that's
California,
where all the data comes from here.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the big gaps in states that don't have good laws that have a centrally, I'll say good laws from a regulatory perspective of concern of like having a state system. So California passed their medical marijuana law in 1996, Proposition 215, and they didn't have a statewide law passed to regulate the businesses that appeared until September of 2015. So although they do have what's known as MMRSA, or the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act.
Oh, crap! You're the first person I've heard give it a name. Say that again.
Oh, it's MMRSA. It's a Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. MMRSA. One thing in the cannabis industry to recognize is there's a lot of acronyms because there's a lot of really long words. So they had almost 20 years of no statewide regulations for the businesses that came about, right? Some of the first businesses, were in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, where enforcement risk was low and the community really supported it because, cannabis, when it was first legalized for medical use.
He had the first cannabis club I knew of.
Yeah, and, that was HIV/AIDS patients in the Bay Area who were, in the gay community who were dying and recognized that cannabis was really helpful for some of the symptoms of HIV and AIDS, as well as some of the medications people were taking at the time. And so you saw some dispensaries there, but really you saw the proliferation around the Western United States and in Colorado and Oregon and Washington and a little bit of Montana in the late 2000s. And the reason that was because, of course, the Obama administration was coming into office. Bush administration was leaving and kind of knew that maybe this enforcement dynamic was going to look a little bit different. People were worried about opening up dispensaries under Republican George Bush administration because of enforcement. And there had been some significant enforcement. But with the Ogden memo that came out, which is a federal memo from the Department of Justice in 2009, we saw just a proliferation of these stores everywhere. And Colorado was the first state to be able to regulate those stores that appeared, right? So the states that had medical marijuana until the late 2000s all had these kind of non-commercial, either implicitly or explicitly non-commercial patient caregiver systems. And so businesses weren't quite envisioned. People are entrepreneurial, particularly when it comes to cannabis. And so they opened these stores in the late 2000s. Colorado regulated them in 2010. Oregon was able to regulate them in 2013, their medical marijuana dispensaries.
Previously, though, in Colorado, there were medical cannabis stores here.
Yeah.
Right?
They were regulated at the local level, some of them.
Yeah, or they were just hoping they weren't going to get busted until 2010.
Yeah, there was a period of time, Chip, as you know, where some of the same dynamics that have existed for a long time in California existed in Colorado, where people would just come in with, 2 pounds of weed and they were a patient and they would just sell that cannabis. That stopped in Colorado once we had a regulated system. But, California didn't have that for so long. And so without that state system, kind of to weave it back for a second, there was no data. There's no data on the number of patients in California because there's no mandatory patient registry system.
Right.
There's some limited amount of data from the Board of Equalization, the BOE.
Only the people who are reporting their sales.
Their sales, yeah, which is really quite a small number. And in addition, what they report is taxable income. So then you have to figure out okay, what is your cost of goods sold margin and how is that affected? How much taxable income do you have? How much total sales do you have? So it's a real imperfect science to try to estimate what that looks like in California. But in places like Oregon and Arizona and Washington and Colorado, particularly some of the states that have passed these adult use laws afterwards, are providing some better data. So it really runs the gamut. Some medical marijuana states will only provide their patient registry information and aggregate it. Of course, you're not going to get individual patient data. So you'll get info on like the number of medical marijuana patients, the ages in different age groups. So you can see like, okay, how many 0 to 12-year-olds, people, minors with epilepsy or other disorders, how many 18 to 25-year-olds, how many middle-aged people, and how many elderly people. And we hear all the time that, everyone, people who have medical marijuana cards are just, young stoners that want to consume.
Using it to get weed.
No, statistically, if you look at this at all of the different states, it's people in that like 35 to 55, those two age brackets.
Right, because stoners already know where to get weed. It's the people who need it for medicine don't know where to get it.
Exactly. And, older people tend to have more ailments, or at least
less connections.
And their bones hurt after hurting them for, whacking them for too long.
Your ass is going to hurt after in a few more days after that bruise comes down. Andrew has the largest bruise I've ever seen on his thigh and lower ass.
That's what happens when you mountain climb.
And he was doing a 14er. That's just what average people here in Colorado do on the weekends, climb a 14,000 foot mountain.
Yeah, well, I mean, you start at this point at like 11,500 feet. So
right. Yeah. Okay. Hey, come on. Make it sound exciting. Like statistics, most people don't think that's too exciting. Me and you are kind of excited about some of the stuff, and I get to read some of the reports you generate, and I read other reports.
Yeah.
Right. So here in Colorado, and we track it seed to sale.
Yeah.
Right. And how long has this been going on? Has this been going on since 2010 or 12?
So that's an interesting thing. So the metric system, seed to sale tracking, there was some requirements, but full on comprehensive tracking didn't really occur until 2014.
2014. So we really only have a couple of real kind of years.
Yeah, we don't quite even have enough data to truly understand seasonal fluctuations.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we've got what is now about 2.5 years of data.
Right. Yeah, in most businesses, you need 3 years, of compiled data before you can really plan anything.
Yeah.
Right. So many people just are guessing on what's happening in the cannabis market. Mm-hmm. They I hear the horror stories with my customers every day of wholesale prices of cannabis dropping. I talk to retail customers that say that their price of consumed cannabis hasn't dropped. So there's money to be made. There's money to be lost here in this industry.
Yeah,
right, for sure.
So I mean, when we're talking about let's go back to data sets for a second.
Yeah. I ramble a little bit.
No, so data sets, let's look at what's available in Colorado and Washington, compare those two for a second, because I think there's some super interesting analogies. And again, this depends, as I said at the beginning of the talk, it's what's on the page that really counts, first and foremost. And in Colorado, in the law, it actually prevents identifying business information from being reported publicly, which makes sense if you're a business owner. You don't want to know the exact, sales that you did have, be that public information. And so you can't correlate that data, even though it's collected through taxes. It's also collected through seed to sale tracking. The state actually knows, at least what's reported, every single business's sales, its cultivation, its efficiency, how much it's transferring, the size of the packages it's transferring, what sort of strains it's growing. So there's a huge amount of information.
Yields per strain, yields per square foot, yields per plant.
So all of that information is available, but none of it is public. And the only person who has had access to that data is my friend Adam Orens at Marijuana Policy Group, who has the contract with the state to actually do their full analysis. So he's the one who's be able to look behind that curtain and really provide some interesting analysis on how much was sold. And
is that who's generating the annual reports?
Yeah, from the state. There's other information that's put out a little more frequently, but those are the projections on how much total demand is there in the black market, as well as in just the total market in Colorado. What does tourism figures look like? But for what they do provide is pretty limited. They say how many different licenses there are, the different types. They say how much marijuana was sold in pounds. They'll say how much marijuana edibles and non-edible products were sold. They don't really provide good information on concentrates. And, they'll put out tax information. So there's a lot you can do there. There's some metrics you can look at. Washington's a lot more interesting. So I'm not exactly sure why. I think it was for banking purposes to make it a little bit easier for banks to appropriately work with the cannabis industry. But in Washington, they make public every single business's month sales.
Wow. Okay.
So you can
it's easy to look at people's.
Yeah, you can really, if you're buying a business in Washington, you could do legitimate due diligence without having to pay much for the actual reports itself. You can really look into a business. You can look at what edible companies are making the most money, what sort of products are available, and how many of those product SKUs exist for the different businesses.
Wow, it's just such a great opportunity in the marketplace right now.
Yeah. So Washington gives out quite a bit of data. So there's just different ways you can compute that different data based upon what is available.
The information isn't exclusive to Washington. We can use it literally all over the country. Or we can make our assumptions, say in Ohio, that people are going to choose similar as they do in Washington.
Yeah, in a certain way. So of course, when you're comparing different states, you have to look at what sort of products are available, right? So in some states, they actually don't allow for certain products. So in Ohio, for instance, smoking is not permitted. In Pennsylvania, under their medical marijuana law, the sale of flower is not even permitted. So that will, you have to look at the product restrictions in addition to looking at, how many patients there are. And we think that consumer trends are going to be similar from state to state. But the reality is that we don't have consumer level data at all when it comes to the sorts of trends of desires and behaviors. We have a little bit of data when it comes to what is the frequency of marijuana consumption and how much do they consume per use day. But we're only just now getting the sort of information.
Yeah, it's not like other products where you could geolocate credit cards and decide how people are spending their money on their credit cards because people don't use credit cards or debit cards in the cannabis.
Further than that, you want to try to figure out how much coffee you're supposed to sell or what, dark roast versus light roast. There are huge data repositories and surveys that have been going on for decades of coffee consumer trends.
Yeah, absolutely.
You try to ask someone how frequently they consume cannabis, what type of cannabis they consume.
So many different answers,
what forms they consume it in.
Yeah.
You don't really get, realistic and accurate answers until probably.
I don't smoke any at all.
Yeah, no, of course. I don't remember the last time I smoked. And so when we're dealing with it, so the data that does exist of this sort of type comes predominantly from federal government agencies that do this surveying in very large ways to track drug use trends because they're worried about drug abuse. Right. So the agency that collects this is SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And so
we've laughed at their reports for years.
Yeah. They give some data like, okay, this is how many people consume. And of course, there's underreporting and things like that. And SAMHSA, the report they put out is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And so that tracks past year cannabis use, past month cannabis use, if you've ever used cannabis, the first age you've started using cannabis. And they also track lots of other drugs, cocaine and opiates and inhalants and hallucinogens and things like that. So the same sort of, interestingly enough, the same sort of data that the federal government has been using to track what in their view is chronic cannabis use and potentially in their view problematic abuse is the same data sets that I use to determine market potential.
Sure it is. One man's trash is another man's treasure, so to speak, right?
And so when I'm looking at this, I really just look at past month marijuana users. Because if you don't consume marijuana in the last month, you're probably just bumming it off friends because they're buying it. Let's say you smoke every 2 to 3 times a year. You probably don't buy your own cannabis.
I know some of those people.
We're happy to share, but the reality is that they may be a cannabis consumer, but they're not a cannabis purchaser. They're not a cannabis customer. And so when I look at data sets of consumption levels, I look at past month marijuana use. And interesting enough as well, because these are federal government data sets, they're principally interested in young people. So the age groups they look at are 12 to 17-year-olds, 18 to 25-year-olds, and people 26 and over. Okay, Obviously, those 26 and over encompass a large number of different age groups,
right.
some of which we'd probably love to know how they consume cannabis in different ways. But the government,
They just
once
lump
you're
them all together, right?
once you're over 25, they don't care if you smoke weed.
I never thought about that way, but I've noticed that statistic in the past. It's like, oh, that's as far as they go.
So what that means is that we essentially have some depressed levels of potential consumer numbers because we're using a 26 and over percentage to apply to a huge number of different people. And I'd imagine those 26 to 30 probably smoke a lot more than those 85 to 90. And so what you're doing is you're really
I got some relatives out there that might be able to push that.
it depends upon what state you're in. Maybe if you're in Northern California and you've been a generational consumer who understands the palliative effects on arthritis,
right?
You're still a cannabis consumer. But my grandparents on the Northeast,
right. You're absolutely right. And we just guess, but like 20s, early 30s is probably the heavier users.
Yeah, definitely. What sort of different people from different age groups consume cannabis? We talked a little bit about underreporting. This data is also, it's lagged. So the most recent information we have comes out from 2013/2014. They kind of aggregate the two years so they can provide this data without it really, compromising any single person's individual
3-4 years ago.
Exactly. And so Colorado, 2013 to 2014. So this is a period of time when cannabis is legal.
But just medical cannabis is legal at that time.
Oh, no, it passed in 2000.
Oh, but not sales.
Not sales, yeah.
Not sales, just possession
exactly.
and smoking is legal.
So 31.25% of those aged 18 to 25 report using marijuana in the last month. That's one of the highest in the state. But it's hard to know, right? Because, of course, we're dealing with something.
Yeah, that's pre-retail or adult use 2014 sales. So the only way you could buy it is if you had a medical card or if you grew it or your friend grew it or you got it on the gray or black market.
Exactly. So sales aren't legal yet, but say that about a little less than a third of people 18 to 25 consume cannabis, which I would say is probably accurate.
I think that's accurate.
But what's interesting is that
2/3 is probably correct. I'm just thinking. I'm in the back of a bar.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a little bit older. I'm 43. Right. So I see some people. I fire up a joint. 2 out of 3 hit it.
Yeah, but you run in circles that are not.
Right.
Not the same.
When you're already in the back of the bar, that's what people are looking for.
I mean, that being
right?
said, when you're talking about young people, it is, it's quite a bit more than it is for older people. So in Colorado, there's only about 12.5% of those 26 and over who consume cannabis. But when you compare this to other states, there's big gaps. And the question is are more people in Colorado actually consuming cannabis than are in Connecticut, for instance? In Connecticut, just 22% of those 18 to 25 say they consume marijuana. It's about 22.5%. And half of the adults in Connecticut of what they have in Colorado, about 6.33%, say they use cannabis once a month. So the question is cannabis consumption in Colorado really twice that of Connecticut? I doubt it. I'd say what's actually happening is that people are less likely to admit to an illegal activity in a state where it isn't illegal.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? So we see all the time.
No, I don't use it. No.
Of course.
I did it once when I was in college.
But in Colorado, admitting to using cannabis is no longer illegal.
I heard Dolly Parton talk about cannabis last night at the Dolly Parton show.
Really?
Rocks.
Nice. Well, I mean, she's a musician, so
she's 70. She toured with Willie.
Oh, yeah, definitely a cannabis consumer.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're seeing in some of these news reports, it said that, cannabis consumption in Colorado is increasing significantly. And that might be true, but I think what's probably more likely is that honesty is increasing significantly about one's cannabis use. Mm-hmm. So you're just going to have more people that say, yeah, actually, no, I have smoked weed. Cultural changes in that area. Right. And so it's always hard to know exactly, what is the number of people that are consuming. In the models that I do.
Is it demand increasing or is it the cultural change? Sure.
And the secret is in almost all of these, all these models, is that the biggest unknown is what is that underreporting. The RAND organization, which is one of the largest kind of nonpartisan policy think tanks in the country that work on all sorts of issues. Drug policy is one thing they look at quite a bit, and their studies show that there's about 25% average underreporting. So you end up adjusting these. And in my models, I'm a little bit more conservative than that because a lot of the states that I work in are those that have some sort of medical laws, so probably have a little bit more of a cultural comfort in admitting to cannabis use. So I adjust where it's upward 20%. I mean, but really we're still dealing with a lot of unknown. And in that underreporting, there's going to be a different range if I'm trying to model out the opportunity in Utah versus in Colorado, because the felony differences in possession of, let's say, concentrates are just enormous. Cannabis in Colorado, possession, it's legal.
So
in Utah, it's serious.
Given a similar environment to Colorado, let's say, all throughout the country, say tomorrow it's legal like it is in Colorado, in South Carolina, and Alabama, and Illinois, just fantasy world. We're in fantasy world here. 20-30% of the people over 26 to 35, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So the two age groups are 18 to 25 and 26 and over.
26 and over. So 20 to 30% of the people 26 and over are using weed or smoking cannabis. Or
I would say probably closer to maybe 15 to 20%.
What's the national average now?
So national average for those 18 and over is 8%. And if you're just looking at those 26 and over, we're looking at 6.1%.
Right.
So
you're adjusting up 20% for that.
Yeah. So that's, that would mean that really it's going to be less than that 15 to 20%. But you're talking about Colorado, for instance, right? So you have to not factor in not only what number of people are being truthful about their cannabis use, but how does that culture affect, maybe people that were past year marijuana consumers who are now going to smoke more frequently, or people who have ever consumed cannabis who are going to try it again. When you're dealing with a difference in culture, you also affect, what is consumed and how it's consumed. And then also, a lot of people move to places like Colorado and Washington and California and Oregon because they are cannabis consumers and they're culturally more connected to those sorts of places.
Accepted.
They feel ostracized hanging out and, growing up in Oklahoma.
Yeah, let's face it. If you walk into a convenience store and you smell like you've just smoked a doobie, using Dolly's phraseology last night, you might feel a little nervous in Oklahoma or Tennessee, but if you're in Northern California, you're going to smell like the guy behind the counter.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
He's been selling laundry detergent to people who've been trimming for the last 3 months.
Right. Absolutely. Cultural differences. That's for sure. Hey, let's take another break there. Back. This is The Real Dirt with Chip Baker and Andrew Livingston. Where were we, Andrew?
So we were talking about how many people in Colorado and other states consume cannabis.
Actually smoke it.
Smoke it. Yeah. How many buy it? How many eat it? Mm-hmm. How many vape it? We don't really know that, but we do know how many people admit to using cannabis.
Absolutely. Right.
So whatever the form, 31% of people 18 to 25 say they use cannabis in Colorado. And those, about
31%. So I just looked yesterday. I think there's 5.5 million people here.
Yeah.
What's that figure come out to?
So population total in Colorado, as I have in 2015, is 4 million. This can't be right. or no, that's those 18 and over. There's 4.1 million in Colorado. Yeah, I think it's about five and a half total population. But of course, I'm not going to be modeling teenagers when it comes to how much cannabis they're consuming.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's wrong to smoke cannabis under 21.
But here's the interesting thing, right?
Unless it's medicinal.
Some states that they'll only allow those 21 and over to buy cannabis, so they're only modeling 21 and over in their cannabis consumption. But as we said earlier, a larger percentage of them consume cannabis. And those who are 18 to 20 are probably buying from someone who's older in the same sort of way that, those 18 to 20 consume a lot of cheap beer, but they have someone slightly older buy it for them.
It's usually when you can smoke the most and drink the most and party the most, 18 to 20.
Yes, when you're in college, you don't have any
coming into it. You're like, ooh.
You don't have all that much responsibility.
Yeah, let's roll an ounce of that presidential.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, we see what percentage of people consume cannabis. How many past month marijuana consumers are. How do we turn that into demand, and what does that demand look like? So it breaks down into different age groups. You see how many consumers there are, and then you have your total number of past month marijuana consumers in Colorado. So in Colorado, what I have for that is 682,000 past month marijuana consumers in Colorado.
Wow.
So a little more than 500,000. That's a pretty good percentage of the population. So when you're looking at the total market, you say, okay.
What do you think the average consumption is?
The average, so that really depends. Because you have to say, okay, I have about 682,000 past month marijuana consumers in Colorado. And how many of them smoke every day? How many of them smoke, once or twice a week? Because that really matters as well.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot. I think it's probably about a gram average
for those who smoke every day, or those who just smoke at all.
Okay, here's how I've said it. For the people who actually smoke weed, you were talking about, that buy it and consume it, I think it's about a gram a week.
A gram a week?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So on average grams per month.
That's what I think. Let's see what the answer is. Answer is
so averages I have is 18 and a half grams per month.
18 and a half grams per month.
That's because, of course it's skewed. You have to look at, the people who smoke 1 to 5 days a month, those who smoke maybe once a week are consuming less than a gram or so per use day. They're consuming one bowl with friends. But if you're an everyday consumer, you're smoking over a gram and a half a day because you're just smoking more frequently. And so you have to look at not only how many past month consumers there are, but you have to look at how many of those that smoke infrequently. So about a little more than a third of past month cannabis consumers in Colorado only smoke 1 to 5 days a month. And similarly, it's about a third of past month marijuana consumers that smoke 26 to 30 days a month, smoke almost every day. It almost looks like a backwards J, which you probably wouldn't be surprised about because there's not that many people who decide, I'm going to smoke every third day of the month.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're either a consumer or you're an occasional consumer.
Right, when someone passes it to you.
Yeah,
right.
So it's kind of you.
I know many people who buy cannabis and only smoke it frequently, or may go through an eighth in 6 months or something like that.
So they probably fit into that, 1 to 5 days, or maybe even not past month consumers. Maybe they only consume.
Well, at that rate, it consumes so little for effectiveness. Because there is a tolerance issue. The more you smoke,
and Colorado weed is strong.
Is stronger than many other places, that's for sure.
So people may have heard of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 principle.
Yeah, absolutely.
People say that,
it's everywhere.
The top, 20% of
top 20%
does 80%, right?
Yeah.
So it's not quite in the cannabis realm. It's a little bit different. It's the top 20% of cannabis consumers smoke about 70% of the volume. There's some people that occasionally consume cannabis, right? When you're talking about people that really only smoke that 11 to 15 days a month, you're looking at just 4.2% of people in Colorado. So this data is a little bit older. It's from 2011/2012 because just some of the The more complicated data sets are provided a little bit later, and there was also I won't go into some technical issues on who was making that data public. It got sold, and so it's a little bit harder to get some of that detailed data. So not that many people that smoke cannabis smoke it that every other day or so. So with this information, we know how many past month marijuana consumers there are, how they break out into the different groups, how much those people in those different groups consume. Those who smoke that 26 to 30 days a month smoke about 1.5 grams or so on estimates, and those about 21 to 25 days a month smoke about 1.3 grams on estimate. So with all of this information, we could figure out how much marijuana do the total amount of people in Colorado consume, residents, in 1 year.
Yeah, well, we get some data right now from the MED through the seed to sale, through the metrics system.
But that doesn't cover everyone, right? Because there's a lot of people that still do not buy cannabis from the legal market.
Just through the legal market, right?
Hey,
how much cannabis was sold last year? Do you know that statistic?
Yeah, so in Colorado, there was 106,932 pounds of marijuana sold in 2015.
Say that figure again.
So
106,000 pounds.
Yeah, it's about 107,000 pounds.
107,000 pounds.
That was just on the adult use side.
On the adult use recreational side. And here in Colorado, the medical side of those 2 years was larger.
Yeah, so medical marijuana sold in 2014 was 109, right?
So just as much.
Right? And I would expect it's probably a similar amount. There's a little more flower is sold on the medical side.
This is all flower or flower and concentrates.
So this is just flower sold. This is what's
just
put out.
Flower, right? So this doesn't even this isn't even concentrates. Right?
This is not even concentrates.
So 220,000 pounds of cannabis was sold to consumers, medical or adult use in Colorado. In
probably a rough estimate. Yeah.
Rough estimate.
Yeah.
Right. And wow, that's a little bit of weed. That's a little bit of weed.
That's quite a bit of weed.
Right. That is.
So that's some of the data that's put out by the state. There's other information as well that's put out by some third-party companies. One of the major ones, Bds Analytics. So they kind of aggregate seed to sale tracking software, and they put out estimates on how much flower and how many products and how many concentrates of those different types are sold. So rough estimates, because of course some of the last 3 months of 2015 haven't been reported by the state. Colorado is not always the best at putting out their data on time. We're looking at maybe roughly 220, 240 pounds of marijuana sold in 2015.
Hell yeah.
It's quite a bit.
40 pounds of weed.
But the estimates on the total pounds of consumption based upon just the total past month consumers, just residents, we're looking at about 340,000 pounds of marijuana.
Wow. So that's all the other cannabis that's smoked.
Yeah, so
it's not through the regulatory system.
Grown
or traded in some manner.
Yeah, so of course it's imperfect science, knowing from all of this
so
exactly how many
black
pounds.
Market. Are we going to call that unregulated market?
I would say that
150,000 extra pounds.
There maybe not 150,000, maybe 100,000 pounds.
Okay, yeah,
is people's home grow, right? So that's still legal.
Oh yeah.
Medical patients growing their own for themselves.
Caregivers.
That's legal. Caregivers growing for medical patients. That's also legal. What gets illegal is anyone who's getting it maybe from Craigslist or someone who's buying it from a friend who's not supposed to buy it. But then it's just like that's kind of gray because it's grown legally, but just a transaction was illegal. So let's say there's about 340,000 pounds of marijuana. It's a lot, again, imperfect science. You also have to realize that the 220 to 250 we were talking about earlier, that includes tourists as well, right? And the 340 just includes residents. So there's still a lot of growth potential in a place like Colorado, even though there is a lot of businesses coming in. And even though we've seen new businesses come in, because of that, we see prices drop a little bit. We've seen sales continue to rise month over month. We're seeing more marijuana sold and businesses making more money. 2015, we had about $1 billion, just under $1 billion of sales. And in 2016, we're seeing our first, $100 million months.
$1 billion in sales, $100 million a month. So it's getting steam. It's starting to take off. There's just recently they've allowed for wholesale production, wholesale sales of cannabis here. And we're really starting to see the impact of that locally. There's lots of conversation on how the wholesale price of weed is dropping. Many businesses started a couple of years ago and set up on pricing from 2 or 3 years ago without anticipating price drop.
Yeah.
Right. So now we hear all kinds of things. I've heard $750 a pound.
Wow, that's lower than I've heard.
Right. I have heard, like just last night, I ran into somebody at Dolly, back to Dolly. He retail grower, wholesale grower in Pueblo. He showed me his video of 8,000 plants they had growing outside. Right. They look pretty good, actually. Yeah. They were using chickens to control their grasshopper problem.
So real integrated pest management.
Great integrated pest management. Right. But those guys said they were planning on selling it for $1,000 a pound.
Wow.
Right. In Northern California, that would be considered a low rate on a large wholesale level.
Yeah.
Right. I'm sure that's changing, but that's how they were going to survive. So I mentioned this to him. I said, hey, man, what do you think about this low price of weed? Some people are selling it for $750 a pound. And he said, well, that's going to affect the small guys, but it's not going to affect us because we're already selling it for $1,000 a pound.
Yeah.
Right. And they're going to grow 8,000 pounds this year. He predicted.
Wow.
Right. So $8 million.
Yeah.
$8 million farm.
That's doing pretty well.
That's doing
off of acreage. It's probably a lot smaller than what it takes to make $8 million in corn or wheat.
Yeah, absolutely. Or alfalfa and the labor as well.
Yeah, totally.
Right. How do you see this trending?
Definitely it's going to, wholesale prices are going to decline. What's interesting is that it's going to decline on the adult use side in Colorado, but not really on the medical side. And that has to do with the way the supply chains are created and how the two markets are different. So the amount of marijuana that can be grown on the medical side depends on the number of medical marijuana patients that are in Colorado's marijuana medical system and their different patient counts and what percentage of those patients with the different patient counts allocate that to a dispensary to cultivate versus allocate it to a themselves or a caregiver to grow. And so the medical supply doesn't increase in the same way that the adult use side does when it comes to just new licenses being issued and those stores just being able to grow more because they can prove it.
This is a complex issue. I thought I asked a simple question.
No. So production management on the adult use side of the market is based upon plant tiers. So it's still based upon the number of plants. If you grow very large plants or very small plants, it just depends on how many plants you grow.
It's not canopy. It's not square feet.
No, it's just plants. So there's a couple different plant tiers. So it's 0 to 1,800 plants. If you want to just open up a new adult use marijuana cultivation facility license in Colorado, you're going to be growing from the start maximum of 1,800 plants, which is quite a bit, but you can't blow out a big warehouse or a big greenhouse with just 1,800 plants.
You're just starting out.
Just starting out. So you then, after 6 months of sales, showing that you've been growing at or near your plant count, can go up to the next plant tier.
Which is growing and selling all the cannabis you produce, right?
Yeah. So it's at least 85%.
Okay, 85%.
Of what you grew. It doesn't have to be 100%, but that's maybe because some of it didn't go well, or you had some failures, and so you can then boost up to the next plant tier, which is 1,800 to 3,600 plants.
All right, now you're starting to grow something.
A little bit more than that. And there's, plant tiers above that is 6,000. And then it gets very large, 10,200.
Now, for my Northern California listeners, you guys are laughing about these small numbers, I know. But that's the way it works here. We were talking earlier that most of the plants that are legally able to be grown aren't even grown right now.
Yeah. So that's what's fascinating, because it's like, even though there's, you can maybe grow 3,600 plants, or a lot of these businesses that were early on in the adult use side because they were existing medical businesses, the way that transition happened, they can actually grow pretty large plant counts. So if you had a very large medical marijuana center under medical, you'll probably have a 10,200 plant count. for your cultivation facility. And, that happened because they said, well, I have a lot of medical patients. I have, make a lot of business. I should be able to grow as much on my medical, actually twice as much on my retail side than I can grow on my medical side, based on the number of patients. And so that's why you see a lot of these pretty high plant count numbers. Even though they said, I need all these plants to cultivate, they likely only had a warehouse or maybe two in the city in Denver, or maybe one in Boulder. And just because you double your plant allocation doesn't mean you're actually being able to grow all of those plants.
Absolutely. You just want as much as you can get.
Exactly. So in Colorado, we're dealing on the retail side with probably, capacity, only about a quarter of total capacity is used.
So part of this
that might be shifting a little bit. The data is a little old, but what we had beforehand was less than 20% in early 2015 was actually being grown.
So part of this is a real estate issue, though, right? Because some people would grow more if they could.
I would say almost all of them probably would.
But they don't have the space. They can't develop the space. It's difficult to build out spaces now. It's expensive to build out spaces now.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And in places like Colorado, a lot of these businesses are bootstrapping. Whereas, a little bit different if you're a well-capitalized individual.
Well, that's the cannabis industry. It's all self-funded. You borrow money from you and your friends. You get, private equity groups or venture capital groups to invest into you. After you've done that, you can't go in the traditional system.
No.
Right.
You can't get bank loans in the same way.
Nobody's going to give you a bank loan.
So building out is expensive and it takes longer. Granted, now we're seeing, farms in areas like Pueblo and the Aurora area where there are actually, big greenhouses. And
has been traditional agricultural for years.
Yeah. Right. So, Pueblo has kind of become one of the epicenters of cannabis cultivation, Pueblo County, which is in southern Colorado. And so those facilities are probably utilizing all their plant counts because they built the farm out to spec. But what's interesting about this is if, let's say, less than a third of the total capacity that's allocated is actually being grown, and the Marijuana Enforcement Division, the regulatory division in Colorado, sets those plant count levels because they want to be able to control the supply of cannabis. They don't want cannabis to be suddenly drop in price significantly because there's a huge supply. They want to know if all of a sudden it's constricting. It's still a legal commodity, can't move across state lines, and so they need to control it. But what we have now is a dynamic in which the puppet master has very long strings on their puppet, and their movement of trying to have more marijuana grown or less marijuana grown, in this case, it's really the pace at which more marijuana grown, is not really affecting the amount of marijuana that's grown, because the amount of marijuana that's grown depends more on the physical capacity and the space limitations, predominantly in warehouses, for Colorado businesses. So we've got a dynamic that even though we see still cannabis prices dropping significantly,
everybody's still selling all their weed.
Everyone's selling all their weed. Supply could increase a lot without the Marijuana Enforcement Division ever really knowing it, without issuing more higher plant tiers. Because suddenly, let's say you move your facility from an area, in Denver, you build out a big greenhouse facility in southern Colorado, and all of a sudden, you take your exact same
10,000 plant count
and you grow actually 10,000 plants.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. That's when it starts to happen.
And so what prices do we see for cannabis? Cannabis is going to drop, obviously, in price. But, still there's, particularly when you're talking about flower, there's a lot of attention that needs to be, put into it. People say, oh, well, cannabis is going to be as, cheap to produce as tobacco. I don't believe that for a number of reasons.
No,
one,
absolutely not.
You can't, no one smokes tobacco for like the quality of the leaf structure.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of, there's a Budweiser market.
Yeah.
Right. And that's lower care.
Yeah.
Right.
Or the concentrate market, which the look of the flower doesn't really matter.
Absolutely. They're just growing it not even to full harvest.
Yeah. Well, you grow it to whatever the maximum cannabinoid, potency is.
Right. Absolutely. Which usually ends up being a couple weeks shorter than the actual maturation time.
Yeah.
Right.
You know that better than I do.
Yeah. Just interesting dynamic means, 8-week strains or 6-week strains, 6-week strains, 5 and 4-week strains now, right? Because the THC doesn't gain. You get terpene changes those last few weeks, but like the last couple weeks.
And you save time.
So says the bro science.
The bro science.
The bro science, right? The economics of it all.
Yeah.
Right. I know there's some extractors out there that are saying different, but that's just what I hear on the street. So we've got inexpensive wholesale pricing. We have lots of consumption, increased consumption. And as always, the farmer, they're getting paid less.
Yeah.
Right. The guy selling the packaged good, he's able to sell it for a larger profit margin. And the farmer's the one that's getting beat up on this. And that's not the only way he's getting beat up, right?
Yeah.
But the 280E, they have even deeper regulations or restrictions.
Yeah, so thanks for mentioning that, Chip. So 280E is a section of the federal tax code. And what it prevents is a business from writing off most of its normal business deductions.
Right.
So if you're a normal business owner, you can write off your employee salaries, you can write off your advertising costs.
All your expenses.
All your expenses.
Right.
In cannabis, you can only write off cost of goods sold.
Cost of goods sold.
So that's what you can write off, but you can't write off your advertising, you can't write off your retail space, can't write off a lot of your business.
Travel.
And so one of the interesting things, so in Colorado, we have a lot of the businesses are vertically integrated. So what happens when you're vertically integrated and you can only write off the portion of your business that deals with the growing of cannabis is you're trying to shift your costs.
Right, absolutely. Have the grow in the back, the sell in the front.
Exactly. Or, you have...
Already in the back, the business in the front.
the mullet economics of cultivation. So what you have, is some dynamics in which a smart business owner is actually going to charge themselves, quite a bit. It's not it's not an arm's length transaction, but you want to charge yourself because you can write off that aspect of cost of goods sold. And so what that means is that a vertically integrated facility is not all that likely to want to have wholesale cannabis in their store. Not only because maybe it's diluting their brand, they have enough cannabis that they grow that they want to sell, but also because if they're buying it from another business, the shifting of that cost is not into their own pockets.
Absolutely.
So 280E creates a very fascinating dynamic in which a business owner may want to continue purchasing from themselves even after the wholesale price is lower than their own cost of production.
That's an interesting way to look at it. So let's describe. Can we describe a scenario where this works?
Yeah. So let's say that you are a cannabis grower.
This is the fantasy world.
You're a cannabis grower, right? Okay. And you also have a store. And you're pretty big. You're pretty good. You can get
slinging weed.
You can drop your price of production down to $200 a pound.
Okay, so I'm growing it for $200 a pound,
right? And let's say you're going to retail that for a lot more than that, right? Let's say
right. Okay, so I bought an ounce of weed today. It was $185 for the ounce.
Yeah, so the margins on cannabis are a little different than they are in many others. You're not just doubling that wholesale to retail prices. But let's just talk about the cost of production for a second, right?
Okay.
So let's say the wholesale market, they can purchase it at like $180 a pound. Let's say it really, really, really drops, right? It's not going to be like this for quite a while, but let's say it really, really drops.
We're talking fantasy here. Sure.
When you're moving your taxes and you say, okay, I want to charge myself that $250 for that pound that I transferred from one side of my business to another, you can write off that $250, and that is a reduction in your total taxable income, and you are making that $200.50. If you buy it from the wholesale market, let's say it's that $180 or $200 a pound, and you pay that, okay, you still write that off in your taxes. That doesn't count as your taxable income. But you're not making that money. Someone else is making that money.
Mm-hmm.
And when the dynamic shift of like, okay, well, I want to write as much off as I can, you want to be profiting off that same thing you're writing off.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's dynamics in which, that's going to just be hard for the wholesale market. So like, how is 280E affecting this? 280E is making it harder for independent cultivators to enter into the legal market into vertically integrated players in Colorado. And this is going to happen in other states as well because 280E is federal. And so that dynamic...
Until the schedule changes, this is how it's going to
be.
be.
It's got to go down to 3. Even Schedule 2, 280E still applies. So if you have a situation in which it's harder for the wholesale market to enter into a vertically integrated retail supply chain, that just means that you're going to just have price stickiness, and consumers are actually going to get hurt by that because they're going to not see the retail price of their cannabis drop in line with the actual increase in supply, because a business is just not going to want to have that increase in supply from their competitors really impact their own pricing and their own supply, their own purchase dynamics.
Well, you're seeing it at a much higher level than I think most people do, because I hear people talk, my customers, they say stuff like, well, if it's $1,000 a pound, I'm just going to stop growing it.
Yeah.
I'm going to buy it on the wholesale market.
Yeah.
Right. Or something like, as long as it's $500 a pound, I can still grow it,
make money
and make money on it. Right. You hear people saying this all the time because it's a farmer mentality, right? They're like, oh, I just grow more to make more.
Yeah. Well,
doesn't really work though.
That works when supply is so much less than demand in the illegal market that you can do that, right? The federal government pays certain farmers to not produce crops.
Right. There's
because supply is as large, if not larger, than demand.
We used to say that campaign against marijuana was government price structuring.
Right. So the CAMP program, the one that Chips mentions, it's a federal eradication policy in concert with local DEA offices and local police offices to fly helicopters into Northern California and Southern Oregon and drop down like commandos and cut down plants.
Yeah, they lost that war.
Yeah,
that's for sure. They are no longer. We overgrew those guys. They got overgrown.
Well, it's expensive way to cut down plants.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they tried for years and years and couldn't make it happen. And that's the black market.
Yeah. So what does that black market look like in California? And in your thought, how many of those people are selling into the gray or semi-legal market in California under medical? And what percentage from them are just selling to other states?
Everybody says that they're legal.
Yeah.
Everybody says that they're legal, regardless if I know if they are or not. And, people come into our stores and they have badges and tags, but I got no idea if those are real or not.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody says that they're legal.
Or maybe they sell 2/3 of it legally.
Right. They could say it could all be illegal. It could all be gray area. But they just say that they're legal. Oh yeah, I'm medical. Oh, I'm medical. I got my 215. And it's just this mentality that they develop in order to do what they're doing.
Have you seen wholesale prices, that kind of gray area, or at least regionally, that gray area in Northern California drop significantly?
Well, I was just back there, and it seems like it's been the same summertime pricing for the past 3 years, which is like $1,700, $1,800 a pound. Right?
And so what's fascinating about that then is, I guess, we're not seeing significant leakage from some of the legal markets in satisfying the demand in the Northeast that would cut down from the demand for that black market cannabis on the West Coast, or more people are consuming, and so it's balancing itself out. Because at a certain point, all of these legal markets are going to start coming online, and what bolsters that $1,700 a pound in Northern California is the fact that people in New York and Massachusetts and Maryland and along the Eastern Seaboard just have to get their large supply of cannabis from that area, but once Massachusetts opens their own medical marijuana dispensaries, there's only a handful of them now. But hopefully when that passes in 2016 for adult use, we're going to see Massachusetts satisfy a lot of the surrounding areas, because you're just going to just drive to a adult use marijuana store, in somewhere in Mass, and there's so many people that live in that Northeast corridor. That's going to affect your black market pricing out in Northern California, because all of a sudden your supply stays the same, but maybe your demand is now being satisfied by other sources.
Right. Well, an interesting thing that happens in all the legal markets that I've seen is that the I don't really like the term black market, but the unregulated
Yeah,
market
yeah,
seems to grow with the regulated market.
yeah.
And part of that is people use it, they change the mentality over it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So where they used to grow 10 plants, now they grow 50,
Yeah.
right? And everyone's accepted it. The attitudes have softened around it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now I go all over the country traveling, doing promotions of my products and sales of stuff and going to trade shows. And people talk about the Colorado influence in their marketplace,
Oh, so
right?
consumer tastes and preferences are shifting.
It,
Maybe more people who are, every other day cannabis consumers become everyday cannabis consumers. And so,
the
yeah,
availability is growing across the country
yeah,
for sure,
yeah.
and we kind of broached slightly this topic, but is it demand or is it acceptance of what's going on? So you
Mm-hmm.
culturally change.
Yeah, and I think both of those feed back on each other.
Hmm.
You know, the more cultural change there is, the more products that are available, the more people who said, maybe I used to be a cannabis consumer, but I don't like smoke anymore.
Right.
But
Ooh,
now I
but
can use a vape pen.
yeah,
Because
I
vape
love
pens don't
edibles.
exist in Pennsylvania, but they
No,
will
they will. They
because
will.
Pennsylvania has a medical market and they don't allow smoking. They don't allow the sale of flower, but they do allow for vaporizable oils.
Right. Absolutely. So, Andrew, what's the future? Can you see into your crystal ball? Do you have a crystal ball here?
I have a crystal ball and it smells like skunk. No, so I would say that
Oh, we're going back to 89.
I wasn't born yet.
Well, that's what we smoked in 89 was skunk.
It was skunk.
Right,
Well, I
right.
mean, I know in
Now it's
Britain they call it
OG
like
Kush
the
and Diesel.
cheese,
The
the
cheese.
stinky.
Yeah.
Part of me thinks that actually the future of cannabis is not the stinkiest of weeds. It's probably more so of those piney, smelling weeds or the fruity smelling weeds. You think about beers. No one really goes for like that skunky beer. And there's certain people that go for the skunky cheese.
Mm-hmm.
But
Goat cheese is so prevalent.
yeah, but not all goat cheese is skunky.
Yeah, I can't eat any of it.
Yeah, so I would say that some of when you talk about taste and preferences, right? We talked about a little bit earlier that when concentrates are produced, you don't always have to grow, for as nice of looking flower. I think probably what we're going to see is some of the future of cannabis is terpene re-enriched vape pens and oils.
Yeah, that's happening right now.
So you see some of it in the market. I've smoked some
growing.
good. It's good stuff that's like reintroduced pineapple or cinnamon or pear. And I think part of the reason you'll see that is
Engineered
just
flavors.
you can do it on an economy of scale in a reproducible way that's
Right.
just more efficient than growing flower.
Right, absolutely. Because you can extract the worst of the flower, get a high end percent, like a 92% or 95%, then add back in the terpenes that you want to
Yeah.
taste or smoke.
And they can be natural terpenes from the plant, right? You can capture terpenes from super nice growing, very floral plants that you get like a, almost like a live resin from. You chop them down perfectly. You find those terpenes, you reproduce it in a way, and then you just apply that onto a base of just cannabinoids.
So concentrates, vape
Yeah.
pens,
Maybe not vape pens.
formulated products.
Formulated products, right? So much more cannabis is on the oil side is smoked in straight loose leaf oils than it is consumed in vape pens.
Right, absolutely.
And that's just because if you're
The dabbing culture and
if you're a cannabis oil consumer, it's just so much more efficient from a price perspective to buy oil that's not put into a small little 300 milligram vape pen.
yeah, absolutely.
And that's just most of those oil consumers are heavier consumers. So what I haven't seen all that much yet is really kind of terpene re-enriched oil for dabbing. How does that work? Are you still able to consume some of those terpenes? Or is the fact that people aren't all that great at lighting their nails and they, it's too hot that they end up burning off all those terpenes anyway?
Right.
That I see as some of the future of cannabis, of some of that re-enriched product. But, there's so many different types of products and different types of innovations that can come out there, not just on the direct, but also on the ancillary level.
Oh, I bet you're in a position where you see so many innovative people come through your offices.
I see a lot of bad ideas too.
Don't we all? Well, hey, you have to go through some bad ones to get to the good ones.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, I ask everybody some similar question to this, and you immediately went different. Almost everybody starts talking about the business.
What do you mean?
Well, everybody's like, the money, this is going to happen. We're going to be able to legalize it here. And you, I think, were the first person who's actually said, hey, we're going to be consuming it differently.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the future of cannabis, like where are the best business opportunities? I would say we're going to see branding and marketing, both in-store and out-of-store, increase substantially. So,
because that's our world.
Yeah. So, another, tie this back to a previous topic. 280E, because you can't write off your retail expenses, means that the most efficient businesses are operating with small retail footprints and not all that much retail space. So think about how much retail space physically there is in a supermarket. There's a lot.
Yeah.
That means that you can put a lot of in-store branding in there. Businesses pay millions and millions of dollars to make sure that their products are at eye level. And none of that exists in the cannabis world. So we're probably going to see some of those similar sort of retail dynamics come about. If you walk into a skateboard shop or a snowboard shop, you'll see a big ottoman display case for just GoPro, for instance.
Absolutely.
And GoPro builds that, and they set it up in each and every one of those stores.
Train everybody how to use it.
In-store branding of the specific products. By and large, that doesn't really exist in cannabis.
Right, and that'd be great. There's there's so much education that needs to happen in the industry. That'd be a great way to see it.
You want to make sure your products are being displayed in the way you want them to.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not much of that. I mean, it's started, but mostly stuff's just hung behind the counter like it would be at a convenience store.
Yeah,
right. It's under a glass counter when you walk in. Right. A few people have digital displays of product.
Yeah.
But yeah. It's an interesting way to think about it. What about schedule? Do you think that's going to change any in the future? What your opinion on that?
So in the future, scheduling will change.
Sure.
But is that going to happen in August? I don't think so.
Yeah, right.
Some people were speculating that that's going to maybe shift. For some points, I thought maybe, but honestly, a move from 1 to 2 doesn't do a huge amount for the existing industry.
Right.
It does potentially help some researchers in the ways that it reduces stigma, but it doesn't even necessarily reduce the barriers to research. Cannabis still would only be able to be grown in the single farm in Mississippi for federal research, even if it was moved down to Schedule 2.
Right. Still no interstate traffic. Still no claims of medical usage.
Well, there's some claims of medical usage, but it's not like the businesses can make those claims.
Absolutely. Right. Just for research purposes initially.
Finally, the federal government would be acknowledging that cannabis has medical use. But
cannibals do not have medical use.
No, they don't. So, cannabis does have medical use, but I would imagine you surveyed people, even people who don't think marijuana should be legal, they're going to say that has some medical use.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. The vast majority of people acknowledge that reality.
So, one thing that's developed in our industry is specific terminology.
Yeah.
Right? Do you come across this?
Sometimes in the metrics on things. So, we'll hear pounds per light. People talk about, pounds per light all the time. Or some here, you'll hear technical things like, powdery mildew, what sort of pesticides you use. You hear about what we talked about a little bit earlier, although this is an agricultural term, integrated pest management. I create some of my own terms like PMMC, or past month marijuana consumers. When you're looking at, what number of people are consuming. Then we also have other acronyms like CBD, or cannabidiol is one of the many terpenes.
Right, because no one can pronounce cannabidiol.
No, I mean, there's even more complicated ones. So CBG, you know what that one is?
Yeah, but I can't pronounce that.
Cannabigerol?
Yeah.
CBN, cannabinol. There's a lot of them, right?
Right.
And then we're dealing with all sorts of different, concentrate products, right? So shatter.
Wax.
Live resin.
Rosin.
Rosin's cool.
Fresh frozen live rosin.
Frozen. I actually hung out with a guy in Vancouver, really cool old school activist and patient who supposedly was the one to pioneer frozen, which is essentially just like frozen water
fresh frozen rosin.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And everyone there is squishing nugs.
Right.
It's a silly thing, but hopefully we'll catch on.
It's kind of silly, but it's interesting the way it's done. It's really simple.
Yeah.
Right. So look up rosin. I'm not even going to try to spell it. To explain it. Rosin. Look it up.
Yeah. Easy to spell.
Yeah. Easy to spell.
So, you see all of those different oil types, terpenes, limonene and pinene and linalool. These are all the different smells and things like that.
Absolutely.
How that affects it.
Absolutely. It is that there is definitely new terminology into our industry.
Yeah, we also have things like, so we've got our edible products, child-resistant packaging.
Tamper
evident.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's make sure, like, during the transaction point from your grow to your dispensary, that you're not actually, tampering with those products. They know how much are in it.
And the tamper evident tape is just tape that says tamper evident.
Yeah, there's markings on it, I guess, so that you can make sure that you don't put over anything. But child-resistant packaging is big in the cannabis industry. That's definitely one of the growing futures on the ancillary side, on the ancillary business, is how do you make specific child-resistant packaging for different edible products? So for a long time,
some of this stuff's so hard to get into now.
Yeah, I mean, for so long, for so many of our products, they were all in pill bottles, right? That's because child-resistant packaging was used for medication and pills. You didn't put a brownie in a child-resistant package because the reason for a brownie or a cookie is to make it edible, oftentimes for kids, right? Like the purpose of candy is to sell candy to kids. If you make it possible for those kids to open that package, that's not the reason But when you're dealing with cannabis-infused candy, you want to make sure that those minors are not getting access to the child-resistant packaging. So there's huge developments in how that packaging is designed for the huge array of different edible products that exist on the market. But there's not really that interesting packaging for flower or concentrates yet, right? And if you think about
so hard to package both of those, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, but think about people are willing to spend in some cases like $40, $50 a gram on high-end concentrates.
Yeah, 80 even.
And they are sold in packages that are like worth 10 cents.
This
right?
is true.
Think about...
We have some Wiz Khalifa product over here, and the outside package looks nice, but then it's just in a little 10-cent glass jar.
Yeah. And it's like, why? Think about another industry that's something similar. Alcohol, right? Think about tequila bottles.
Yeah, if you got $100 tequila bottle.
That's going to be a nice bottle.
Right.
That bottle itself is probably going to cost $1 or $2. Maybe more, right? Spend a lot of money on
packaging, high-end packaging.
High-end packaging is not matching the high-end products. You see across-the-board packaging, whether or not it's a cheap, wax, that's a CO2 wax, or whether or not it's a really nice live resin.
Right. Part of that is the banking and financing, though. Mm-hmm. Everything is bootstrapped. Everything is self-financed. To put money into packaging or machines that can use packaging and make it automated and it still be a cool package. Most people get leases on equipment like that. You're mixing potting soil, for instance. You're going to put $1 million into equipment, but it's going to be a lease on the equipment.
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard to get a lease on $1 million food packaging machine.
I mean, I would say probably most people are packaging concentrates by hand.
Absolutely. I was thinking the edibles more than,
Yeah, the edibles on that, definitely. Story. There's a few facilities that really have like large scale, nice, expensive packaging machines, but those are handfuls.
Stuff, man, that stuff's pretty nice. The 5 milligram individual dose.
Yeah, I mean, that's expensive packaging on the edible side. Mm-hmm. And there I can see regulatorily, they're being pushed in a way that packaging is very expensive, particularly having child-resistant packaging for those edible products. But on the concentrate side, in Colorado, a lot of the products are sold in child-resistant packaging, but it just has to be sold as to the consumer. It doesn't actually have to be packaged from the manufacturer in child-resistant packaging if you're dealing just with concentrates. You can have what's known as an exit package, which is another term of art of the cannabis industry. Essentially, like it's a large child-resistant bag.
Right.
You'd put the products in, right? So they want to make sure it's child-resistant when it's sold, but it's not actually child-resistant when it's produced. Edible products have to be in child-resistant packages when they're produced. So there's a lot of wiggle room on cool packaging that could happen with flower and with concentrate, and I don't see it, but I want to see it because that sort of innovation would be really interesting.
Right. Nobody's making pre-rolled joints that still have the flavor of a fresh rolled joint. Right. That's still difficult to get.
Yeah.
Here in the dry Colorado climate, to have flour that's not powder dry when you get it, that's difficult to get.
Yeah.
Right. Lots of innovations for sure. Yeah. And who is it? Kush Bottle. Mm-hmm. Right. Those guys, they've done really well.
Yeah. Because they're looking at low cost, easy to open packaging. So much what's annoying with a lot of the pill bottles is that they're like beveled or lipped in certain ways. Mm-hmm. And when you want to pour out your cannabis, you want to just come out. Right. So those Kush bottles, those pop top bottles we see everywhere. Yeah. Just because they're so cheap, so easy to open. They're technically child resistant. Mm-hmm. I guess you have to be old enough to have enough hand pressure to pop them open.
Straight, yeah, right.
And they sound like Pringles. Once they pop, the fun don't stop.
Absolutely. So, man, we've done a pretty good job today. We've covered a lot of topics. Have we missed anything here?
I would say the only thing we've mainly missed is what's going to be on the ballot in 2016.
Yeah, what's going to be on the ballot in 2016? What's the future that way?
Okay, so future of cannabis is California's large market. Hopefully, it's Massachusetts growing in large market. Hopefully,
this is on the ballot 2016.
Yeah, hopefully it's Las Vegas. Hopefully Nevada changes over
to adult use,
and we really see the tourism potential of Sin City come to blossom. Hopefully, it will reduce some of the drunken shenanigans, and we'll have some.
Oh man, it'll make the heat in the desert so much better to deal with.
Yeah, I'm not a gambling hot casino fan, so I might not spend most of my time.
End up going to trade shows there. Never make it to a casino or to see any type of show, but trade show.
And hopefully, we'll see it in Arizona. That's a little bit less likely. Hopefully, we'll see it in Maine as well. I have some friends who worked on that campaign. If you've ever been to Portland, Maine, it is beautiful. Yeah, it's amazing.
Incredible place.
If you really like getting high and going hiking while picking blueberries and eating lobster, you should go to Maine, and hopefully we'll legalize there as well. Then we'll see medical laws hopefully pass in places like Florida and Missouri and possibly Arkansas, possibly even Montana. They actually have a medical law, but it kind of got decimated. Yeah.
Wow, it's the future's bright.
Yeah. I mean, there's just going to be a lot going on. I would say there's a lot riding on this next November, not only on the cannabis side, but I would say, personally, there's a lot going on from the presidential side. I'm a politics and policy nerd at large.
Right.
And, hopefully that doesn't negatively affect the cannabis industry, but it has some potential to. So I would say what you really have to make sure is that you tell your friends to vote. You go out and vote.
Absolutely.
You work on some of these campaigns where if you can, you donate to some of these campaigns if you can.
That's how you get it happen. That's how we got it to happen here in Colorado.
Exactly.
That's how it happened in California is people donated. People put their time in.
Yeah.
Gave cash, gave time.
And when we talk about, a $13 billion marijuana industry by 2020, those are some of my internal projections, that means we're going to see those states pass. If Massachusetts doesn't pass, or if Nevada doesn't pass, or Arizona doesn't pass, we're not seeing that $13 billion estimate.
Right.
And in every single one of these entrepreneurs' business projections in their decks that they are raising money for, they bake in future projections of legalization that will only happen if we make it happen.
Absolutely. The future's ours if we want it.
It's the only way it is.
We've seen it change, though. It's happening. Yeah. It's happening right now.
Yeah, but the ball is not going to roll down the hill by itself. Even though we think it is, we're going to have to keep pushing it. There's friction, huge amount of friction. It might roll, but it's not going to roll at the speed we want it to. And we want it to roll really fast.
Right, absolutely. Fast rolling boss. Awesome, Andrew. Well, hey, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Chip. I love chatting with you. I love podcasting, sitting down and talking for a while. You're one of my favorite people to do it with. So thanks.
Well, appreciate it. Same. I feel the same way, Andrew. Let's just keep chatting.
Okay.
All right. Hey, let's just turn this off and roll some up. How about that?
Sounds good.
All right. Awesome. It's The Real Dirt.